I was 19 years old when the mountain first showed me its secret face, and I have carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest for more than 30 years. They tell you in the villages that the Himalayas belong to the gods, that mortals only borrow passage through their domain, but no one tells you what to do when something ancient decides to save your life. That winter I went up alone for the first time, eager to prove myself worthy of the title my father had carried, the title his father had carried before him. The expedition was routine, a supply run to Camp 2, nothing that should have challenged a young man raised in the shadow of these peaks. But the mountains do not care about bloodlines or bravado, and when the blizzard came screaming down from the summit like the breath of something primordial and furious, I understood for the first time what it meant to be utterly insignificant. The world became white. Violence, a chaos of ice and wind that turned familiar paths into deadly mazes. I could not see my hands in front of my face, could not hear my own voice shouting for help, could only feel the terrible certainty that I would die here, alone, swallowed by the whiteness before my life had truly begun. Then I saw the shadow, and everything I thought I understood about the world began to crack and reshape itself. It moved through the blizzard like the storm was nothing more than morning mist, a massive darkness that should not have been able to exist in that obliterating white. At first I thought it was delirium, the beginning of the end when the mind creates comfort from nothing. But then I saw the eyes. They glowed with a light that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old, not reflecting the sparse visibility, but generating their own amber radiance through the screaming snow. The shadow reached for me with arms that seemed too long, too powerful, covered in fur that the wind could not penetrate, and every instinct told me to run even as my freezing body refused to move. I felt myself lifted, pulled against something warm and solid, that smelled of earth and musk and ancient stone, carried through the storm as if I weighed nothing at all. The wind howled its fury around us, but could not touch me anymore, sheltered against this impossible chest, this creature that moved with purpose through terrain that would have killed me in minutes. The cave appeared like a wound in the mountain's face, a darkness that promised shelter or doom. I could not tell which. Inside, away from the blizzard's rage, I finally saw what had saved me, and my breath stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. The Yeti stood before me, not the monster of expedition stories told around dying fires, but something far more profound and terrible in its reality. Its body bore the scars of decades, perhaps centuries, deep marks across its chest and arms that spoke of battles with the mountain itself, with avalanches and rockfalls, and the thousand ways these peaks tried to kill. It watched me with eyes that held an intelligence I was not prepared to acknowledge, and when it rumbled, the sound came from somewhere deep in its chest, a language of gesture and vibration that bypassed words entirely. The creature moved to the back of the cave and returned with dried meat, impossibly preserved, and ranged itself between me and the entrance, a living barrier against the storm that continued its assault on the mountain. Outside, in that moment I understood that I had not stumbled into salvation by chance, that this being had chosen to pull me from death's grip, and that choice implied a purpose I could not yet comprehend. For 3 days the blizzard screamed its ancient psalm while I sat in that cave with the legend made flesh, and nothing in my 19 years had prepared me for the weight of that silence between us. The Yeti tended a small fire with wood that must have been gathered over years, precious fuel stored for purposes I was only beginning to understand. It did not sleep, only watched the cave entrance with a vigilance that seemed eternal, and sometimes it would turn those amber eyes on me with an expression I can only describe as profound sadness mixed with resignation. I tried to speak, to thank it, to ask the 1,000 questions burning in my mind, but it would only gesture in response, drawing symbols in the dust that I could not yet read, teaching me in those 3 days the beginning of a language older than the villages below. When the storm finally broke and dawn light filtered into the cave, the Yeti stood and walked to the entrance, then turned back to look at me one final time before disappearing into the snow. I stumbled down the mountain alone, found my group, told them I had sheltered in a crevasse, and said nothing about the truth that had changed everything I believed about the world and my place in it. The creature that saved my life stood perhaps 8 feet tall, its body a architecture of muscle and fur that seemed designed by the mountain itself, for survival in conditions that would destroy lesser beings. In the firelight I could see details that the blizzard had mercifully obscured, the thickness of its coat ranging from silver white across the chest to deep charcoal along the spine, each hair seeming to trap warmth in layers that no human clothing could replicate. Its hands were the most disturbing feature, massive and powerful, yet possessing a dexterity that became apparent as it tended the fire. Fingers that could clearly crush bone, moving with surprising delicacy to arrange kindling and adjust burning wood. The face defied easy description, neither fully ape nor fully human, but something that existed in the terrible space between. A countenance that held both the wildness of untamed peaks and something that looked disturbingly like wisdom. Those amber eyes never stopped, watching, assessing, and in their depths I began to perceive not animal instinct but consideration, the kind of measured thought I associated with village elders, who had seen too much of life's cruelty to speak carelessly. When it moved, there was no wasted motion, every gesture economical and purposeful, the efficiency of something that had survived in the harshest environment on earth through sheer adaptation and will. The communication began in gestures so subtle I almost missed them, a language written in the angle of a massive hand, the tilt of that impossible head, the rumbling vocalizations that seemed to resonate in my chest. As much as my ears, the Yeti pointed to the dried meat it had offered, then to its own mouth, making clear that this was food, that I should eat, that survival required fuel. When I hesitated, uncertain whether this flesh came from mountain goat or something I did not want to consider, it rumbled again, a sound that somehow conveyed reassurance without words, and gestured more insistently until I took a piece and chewed. The meat was tough, gamey, but unmistakably animal, and as I ate I watched the creature settle itself against the cave wall with a heaviness that spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue. It touched its chest, then gestured to the mountain outside, then drew a circle in the dust at its feet that it filled with quick marks, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. I understood then that I was not the first it had pulled from the storm, that this rescue was part of a pattern, a duty that had been performed again and again across a span of time I could not calculate. The scars on its body suddenly took on new meaning, each mark a story of someone saved or tried to save. Decades or perhaps centuries of solitary guardianship written in damaged flesh and healed tissue. As the storm raged through that first night, I watched the Yeti maintain its vigil with a dedication that transcended simple animal behavior, and the implications began to reshape my understanding of the mountain and the legends that surrounded it. It would periodically rise and move to the cave entrance, standing there for long minutes as if listening to something beyond the wind's howl, its head tilted in concentration, before returning to the fire. Once, I dozed and woke to find it arranging rocks in careful patterns around the flames, creating what looked almost like a shrine or memorial, each stone placed with a precision that suggested meaning beyond my comprehension. When it noticed I was awake, it paused in its work and regarded me with an intensity that made me feel transparent, as if those ancient eyes could see not just my physical form, but the lineage behind me, the generations of guides and mountain men, whose blood ran in my veins. It reached out slowly, giving me time to recoil if I chose, and touched my forehead with one massive finger, gentle despite its obvious strength. And in that moment, I felt a connection I cannot adequately describe, a sense of being known and recognized at a level deeper than names or words. The gesture held something like blessing, or perhaps acknowledgement, and when it withdrew its hand I saw it trace a symbol in the air between us, one that I would not understand until years later, when I found my grandfather's hidden journals. The second and third days in that cave became a silent education in humility and wonder, as the Yeti revealed through patient gesture and careful demonstration that it possessed knowledge accumulated across lifetimes of solitary existence. It showed me how to read the subtle signs of approaching avalanches and the quality of silence, how to identify which ice formations held safe water and which contained minerals that would sicken. It drew elaborate maps in the cave dust, indicating safe passages and deadly crevices with an accuracy that spoke of intimate familiarity with every ridge and valley across hundreds of miles of peaks. Between these lessons it would return to its motionless watching, and I began to recognize in its bearing the profound loneliness of something that lived between worlds, neither fully beast nor remotely human, bound to a purpose that allowed no companions and promised no relief. On the final morning, as dawn broke clear and cold outside, it placed one massive hand over its heart, then pointed to me, then to the mountain, and finally drew in the dust what I slowly recognized as a calendar stone, circles marked with seasons, dozens of them, perhaps 100. The meaning was unmistakable, a promise and a request that I would return, That this encounter was not an ending but a beginning. That I had been chosen to witness something that could not be allowed to fade unnamed and unremembered into legend. I kept my promise that first year, though I told no one the true reason for my return to that particular pass when winter arrived. I brought supplies carefully chosen: dried yak meat wrapped in canvas, medicinal herbs from the village healer, batteries for a small lamp I thought might prove useful in the cave's darkness. I left them at the entrance where it had released me that spring morning, ranging them as I had seen it arranged the memorial stones, with intention and care. For 2 days I waited, camping in bitter cold, uncertain whether I had imagined the entire encounter in the delirium of near death, whether the Yeti was a hypothermia-induced hallucination my desperate mind had conjured to make sense of unlikely survival. On the third dawn I woke to find the supplies gone, and in their place a collection of objects that stopped my breath. A climber's compass from the 1930s, its brass case engraved with initials worn almost smooth, a perfectly preserved edelweiss pressed between sheets of what looked like mica, and a small carved figure of a snow leopard so exquisite it could only have been shaped by hands capable of impossible delicacy. These were not random objects, but chosen gifts, selected to communicate across the barrier of language, each one a statement that I was remembered, that my return had been anticipated, that the connection forged in that storm-bound cave remained intact despite the months between. The pattern established itself over the following years, becoming a rhythm as reliable as the seasons themselves, though the nature of our exchanges evolved in ways I could never have predicted. Some winters I would find the Yeti waiting, that massive form materializing from snow and shadow as I approached the pass, and it would lead me through terrain that defied my maps, showing me routes that seemed impossible until I walked them under its guidance. It moved through the mountains with a certainty that transcended mere familiarity, each step placed with absolute confidence even in whiteout conditions, as if the stone itself spoke to it in languages older than human memory. During these journeys it would pause periodically and gesture to specific locations, rock formations or ice walls that looked unremarkable to my eyes, and through patient repetition I began to understand. It was marking places where climbers had fallen, where rescues had failed, where the mountain had claimed lives despite its interventions. The gestures held something like grief, a sorrow so deep and ancient it seemed woven into the creature's very being, and I realized that every life it had failed to save weighed upon it with a burden I could scarcely imagine. Other winters I would arrive to find only signs of its presence, the supplies carefully redistributed with some taken and others left, new gifts arranged in patterns that gradually revealed themselves as a form of communication, teaching me to read the mountain's moods through the language of objects and placement. The villagers began to notice changes in me that I could not adequately explain, a certainty in my route planning that seemed almost prescient, an ability to sense approaching storms with an accuracy that defied meteorological science. I would cancel expeditions that other guides deemed perfectly safe, turning back wealthy clients who complained bitterly, until the avalanches came exactly where I had predicted, sweeping paths we would have walked hours earlier. I began to understand that the Yeti was somehow sharing its knowledge across the distance between our meetings, that the connection established in that first cave had created a channel through which information flowed in ways that transcended ordinary perception. Sometimes I would wake in my home valley with absolute conviction that I needed to reach a certain ridge, and I would climb for hours through darkness to arrive just as a lost trekker stumbled into view, frostbitten and delirious, saved by timing too precise to be coincidence. The other guides whispered that I had been blessed or cursed by mountain spirits, that something had changed in me during that solo expedition years ago, and they were not wrong, though the truth was far stranger than their superstitions could encompass. I saw the Yeti only in glimpses during these years, a shadow on a distant ridge watching as I led climbers through dangerous passes, a massive shape barely visible in blowing snow that would vanish when I looked directly at it, always present, but maintaining a distance that felt like both protection and loneliness. In my 30th year of keeping this silent covenant, I began to perceive patterns in the Yeti's appearances that suggested something beyond random guardianship, an intelligence that was actively studying human behavior and making decisions based on observation, accumulated across decades or centuries. It would show itself before disasters, yes, but also at moments of human cruelty or kindness, watching from concealment when clients mistreated porters, or when strangers showed unexpected generosity to struggling climbers. I realized it was not simply protecting lives, but bearing witness to humanity itself, cataloging our nature through patient observation, and I wondered what conclusions such a creature might draw from its vigil over our endless procession of ambition and folly. The gifts it left became more personal, objects that seemed selected with knowledge of my private life. A button from my father's coat that had been lost on the mountain 20 years before my birth. A photograph of my grandmother as a young woman that I had never seen but recognized instantly in the shape of her eyes. These impossible returns suggested the Yeti had been watching my family for generations, that I was not the first of my line to enter into this strange communion, and the implications filled me with an awe that bordered on terror at the depth of time and purpose I was only beginning to comprehend. The whispers in the village intensified as climbers continued to vanish with unsettling regularity, their disappearances attributed to demons or vengeful spirits, by those who needed supernatural explanations for the mountain's cruelty. But I had begun to notice what others could not see, patterns invisible to those who did not know to watch the high ridges with patient attention, and an understanding of what shadows should and should not move against snow and stone. During every expedition I guided, I felt the weight of observation from above, and when I permitted my gaze to drift casually toward certain cliff faces or distant promontories, I would catch fleeting glimpses of that massive form silhouetted against sky or ice, positioned always where it commanded views of our route and the weather approaching from the peaks beyond. The Yeti was watching not with menace, but with the focused intensity of a shepherd counting vulnerable flock, and I came to recognize the specific quality of alertness in its posture that preceded danger, the subtle shift in how it held itself that signaled I should prepare for rapid descent or seek immediate shelter. This silent communication operated below the threshold of conscious thought, a visceral knowing that bypassed language entirely, and I found myself making decisions that saved lives, without being able to articulate why. I knew with such certainty that we needed to abandon a summit attempt or change our planned route through terrain that appeared perfectly safe to every rational assessment. The correlation between the Yeti's appearances and impending catastrophe became undeniable once I started keeping detailed records in journals I shared with no one, documenting each sighting alongside weather conditions and subsequent events with the meticulousness of a scientist studying phenomena beyond accepted reality. 3 hours before the avalanche that buried the French expedition on the north face, I had seen it standing motionless on the western ridge, facing toward their camp with a stillness that radiated urgency despite the absence of any movement or sound. When the American team ignored weather warnings and pushed for the summit against all advice, the Yeti appeared on for separate occasions during their ascent, moving closer to the established route with each sighting, its presence growing more overt as if desperation was overcoming its usual caution about revealing itself to those who might not understand. I tried to warn them using mundane justifications, citing barometric pressure and wind patterns, but they dismissed my concerns as the superstition of a local guide intimidated by their superior equipment and experience, and I watched helplessly as they climbed toward disaster while that ancient guardian shadowed their progress, unable to intervene more directly without exposing the secret it had kept for centuries. In the hours before the storm hit with apocalyptic fury, I saw the Yeti one final time, standing fully visible on an outcrop barely 200 meters from their high camp, and the anguish in its posture was unmistakable even across that distance. The slumped shoulders and bowed head of a being who knew exactly what was coming and could not prevent it. The aftermath of that storm revealed something that transformed my understanding of the Yeti's purpose and the depth of its burden, a revelation that came not through dramatic disclosure but through the accumulation of small observations that assembled themselves into terrible comprehension. For climbers from that American team vanished completely. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search operations, and the official reports classified them as lost to crevices or blown from the mountain by winds that had exceeded 100 miles per hour. But I had seen the Yeti during the storm's height, a vision that should have been impossible through the whiteout conditions, but burned itself into my memory with hallucinatory clarity, moving through the blizzard as if the wind and snow parted before it, carrying something with careful deliberation toward the hidden places where I had never been permitted to follow. In subsequent weeks I noticed it watching rescue operations with an intensity different from its usual observation, and I understood with sudden insight that it was not watching for survivors, but ensuring that certain bodies would not be found, that some of The lost were being taken somewhere for reasons I could not yet fathom. The realization should have filled me with horror, but instead I felt a strange calm, a certainty born from 3 decades of silent partnership that whatever the Yeti did with those it retrieved served purposes older and more sacred than I could comprehend from my limited human perspective, that I was witnessing the continuation of a covenant established long before my ancestors first approached these peaks. The distinction between the dead who were found and those who vanished completely began to reveal its own pattern once I studied the records with this new understanding guiding my analysis. And what emerged was not random selection, but criteria based on something the Yeti alone could perceive or judge. Those who were recovered had died quickly, their suffering minimal, claimed by false or exposure before fear could transform into prolonged agony, and their bodies were left where search teams would eventually locate them, returned to families who needed the closure of burial and mourning. But those who disappeared had suffered longer, trapped in crevices or dying slowly from injuries sustained in falls. And I realized the Yeti was taking those whose final hours had been filled with terror and pain, selecting them for a different fate that involved the preservation and honor I had witnessed it bestowing on the memorial stones during that first encounter decades ago. It was an act of mercy as much as duty, a refusal to let the mountain's cruelty define their final rest. And I understood that the whispers about demons stealing climbers were tragically inverted, that this creature was offering a form of salvation to those who died badly, gathering them with ancient gentleness into some sacred space, where their suffering could be acknowledged and their humanity preserved beyond death's indignity. The catastrophic whiteout descended, with a violence that transformed the familiar mountain into an alien geometry of wind and ice, visibility collapsing to arm's length as temperatures plummeted to levels that could kill exposed flesh in minutes, and I knew with absolute certainty that my small expedition group would die if we remained on our current course toward base camp. Through the screaming chaos of snow and wind I glimpsed the massive silhouette positioned impossibly close to our position, violating every pattern of caution the Yeti had maintained across 3 decades, and I understood this proximity was not chance but urgent summons, a breaking of protocol that communicated desperation more effectively than any words could convey. My clients were experienced climbers from Germany who had hired me for what should have been a straightforward acclimatization trek, rational people who trusted instruments and training, and I knew they would never follow me off trail into unmapped territory based on instinct and the guidance of a creature they could not see and would not believe existed. Yet as I watched the Yeti turn and begin moving perpendicular to our planned route, heading toward terrain my maps showed as impassable glacier fields studded with crevices, I understood I faced a choice between professional credibility and the survival of everyone under my care, between the reasonable path that led to certain death and the impossible route promised by a guardian whose judgment had never failed me. I made the decision without fully understanding my own reasoning, shouting coordinates that made no logical sense and physically turning the lead climber when he hesitated, manufacturing authority from 3 decades of reputation and the primal conviction in my voice that bypassed rational objection and triggered the instinct to follow experience when conditions exceeded comprehension. We moved through the whiteout for hours that stretched into surreal timelessness, the world reduced to the few feet of visibility ahead and the massive shadow that appeared and disappeared through curtains of driving snow, always positioned just at the edge of perception, leading us with the patience of a shepherd guiding blind sheep through territory only it could navigate. My GPS had stopped functioning 30 minutes into our deviation, the satellite signal lost to interference I could not explain, and my compass spun uselessly as if we had entered some zone where magnetic north held no meaning, leaving me dependent entirely on the Yeti's guidance and a bone-deep trust that felt simultaneously insane and more reliable than any technology humans had devised. The Germans followed without question after the initial resistance broke, their faith in my authority absolute even as I led them deeper into terrain that should have been suicidal to attempt in perfect visibility, much less during a storm that had reduced existence to wind and ice. And the next careful step, I felt the weight of their trust like a physical burden, knowing I was staking their lives on the guidance of a creature from legend, and the internal conflict between rational doubt and mystical certainty created a splitting tension in my consciousness to versions of reality existing simultaneously as I walked the knife edge between salvation and catastrophic delusion. The Yeti's shadow grew more substantial as we progressed, as if the deeper we moved into its territory, the more completely it could manifest, and I noticed details I had never seen clearly before: the careful placement of each massive footstep, the way it tested ice before leading us across surfaces that looked identical to the deadly thin sheets surrounding them, the deliberate marking of safe passage through a labyrinth of hidden dangers that would have claimed us within minutes without its intervention. The wind died with supernatural abruptness as we descended into a depression I had never known existed, the storm's fury continuing above us while we moved through suddenly still air thick with swirling ground snow. And ahead the ice face revealed itself as something other than natural formation, too regular in its architecture, too precisely angled to be accident of weather and geology. The Yeti stopped at the entrance to what I first perceived as a large ice cave, but quickly recognized as something far more significant: a vast cavern whose opening had been concealed by deliberate arrangement of snow and ice that created the illusion of solid cliff face when viewed from any approach except the exact route we had taken. It turned to face me directly for the first time in 3 decades, and in the diffused light that filtered through layers of ice I saw its features with clarity that had never been permitted before. The deep intelligence in eyes that held accumulated centuries of solitary purpose, the scars that mapped a lifetime of rescue and recovery across terrain that killed humans with casual efficiency, the profound exhaustion of a being that had carried an impossible burden for longer than my family line had existed. Through gesture and the rumbling vocalization that bypassed language to communicate directly with some older part of my consciousness, it conveyed both warning and invitation, asking if I was prepared to witness what it had guarded for lifetimes, to carry knowledge that would fundament. The Germans remained at the cavern's entrance where I positioned them with instructions to wait, their questions dying unspoken when they saw my expression, and I followed the Yeti deeper into passages that descended through layers of compressed ice that held the frozen record of centuries, the walls glowing with ethereal blue luminescence that seemed to emanate from within the ice itself, rather than from any external light source. The passages opened into chambers of increasing size, each one a gallery of preserved equipment and supplies ranged with careful intention, climbing gear spanning decades of technological evolution from hemp ropes and wooden-handled axes to modern carbon fiber and synthetic materials, all of it organized by some system of meaning I could not immediately comprehend, but recognized as deeply purposeful. The Yeti moved with reverence through these spaces, its massive form surprisingly graceful as it navigated between displays that represented recovered fragments of human ambition and tragedy, and I understood I was being guided through something that was simultaneously museum, memorial, and sacred repository. The temperature held steady at a level that preserved without destroying, and the silence was profound and cathedral-like, broken only by our careful footsteps and the occasional distant groan of settling ice that sounded like the mountain itself breathing. I counted tents from at least 15 different expeditions, cooking equipment inscribed with names and dates that triggered vague memories of disappearances reported in climbing journals I had read as a young man, personal items whose intimate nature: a harmonica, a chess set, a child's drawing sealed in plastic conveyed the humanity of their owners with devastating immediacy. The Yeti paused at each chamber's threshold as if seeking permission to proceed, and I realized it was offering me the choice to continue or turn back, to protect myself from knowledge that could not be unknown once witnessed. But I had come too far through too many years to refuse the truth it had protected and was now ready to reveal. The deepest chamber opened into a space so vast my headlamp could not illuminate its far walls, and the bodies were immediately visible, arranged in concentric circles radiating from the chamber's center like petals of some terrible, frozen flower, each figure positioned with obvious care and respect, hands folded across chests or positioned at sides, faces visible through the crystal-clear ice that had become their eternal coffin. I counted 19 bodies in the immediate vicinity, and sensed there were more in the darkness, beyond my light's reach, climbers from multiple nationalities and eras, judging by their equipment and clothing, some wearing gear so old it predated modern mountaineering techniques, others dressed in suits that would not have been out of place in my own supply closet. Their faces were serene in a way that contradicted every frozen corpse I had encountered in 3 decades of mountain work, none of the contorted agony that usually marked death by exposure or trauma, and I understood the Yeti had retrieved them before the final moments of suffering, bringing them here while some spark of life remained, allowing them to pass in shelter rather than alone in the storm. Around each body a circle of Personal effects have been carefully arranged like offerings at a shrine, photographs of loved ones placed where frozen eyes could see them, letters sealed in waterproof containers, journals open to file entries, wedding rings positioned on folded clothing, each display a meditation on the life that had ended and the connections that survived beyond death. The Yeti moved between the bodies with the familiarity of a caretaker tending graves, adjusting the position of a photograph here, straightening climbing rope there. And I saw that some bodies had been here for decades while others were recent enough that I recognized their faces from missing persons reports posted at base camp. Tears froze on my cheeks as I understood the magnitude of what I was witnessing. Not a predator's lair, but a shepherd's final service. A being that had dedicated its existence to ensuring that those who died on the mountain did not die alone and forgotten, that they were honored and preserved and remembered even when the world below had moved on and given them up as lost. I recognized Dieter Hausmann in the third circle, the German climber who had vanished 7 years earlier during a solo summit attempt, his disappearance attributed to a fall into a crevasse that rescue teams never located. And seeing him here ranged peacefully, with his wife's photograph positioned against his shoulder, created a vertigo of realization that extended backward through years of unsolved disappearances. The Japanese expedition of 1998 that lost 2 members to sudden weather, the American woman who vanished without trace in 2004, the Sherpa porter from a neighboring village who disappeared during a supply run in 2011. All of them were here, retrieved and honored, removed from the narrative of the mountain's cruelty and placed instead into this secret cathedral of compassion. The Yeti watched me process these recognitions, and I understood it had brought me here not just to witness but to carry knowledge back to the world, to transform the story of these deaths from mystery and speculation into something closer to truth, even if that truth could never be fully explained or believed. I knelt beside Pasang Nuru, the porter I had known personally, a young man with a quick smile who had left behind 3 children, and I placed my hand against the ice that separated us, feeling the cold burn against my palm while grief and gratitude warred in my chest. Grief for the loss, gratitude that his final hours had been witnessed by this guardian rather than experienced in solitary terror. The weight of responsibility settled onto me with crushing force as I understood what was being asked, that I would become the bridge between this hidden truth and the families who still wondered, the keeper of knowledge that could bring both comfort and questions that could never be fully answered. And I nodded to the Yeti in acceptance of a burden I had not sought but could not refuse. The Yeti gestured toward the chamber's center where the ice formed in natural days, and carved into the walls surrounding this focal point were images that predated written language, pictographs showing figures that were clearly Yeti retrieving smaller human forms from various postures of distress and carrying them to sheltered spaces, a visual narrative that stretched across yards of ice surface and represented centuries of repetition and duty. I moved closer to examine the carvings and saw they were not merely decorative but documentary, a historical record maintained across generations, with distinct artistic styles suggesting different hands had added to the chronicle over vast spans of time, each Yeti apparently contributing to the record of its service before passing responsibility to the next. The earliest images showed multiple large figures working together, a community of guardians, while the progression through time depicted fewer and fewer, until the most recent carvings showed only a single figure, the one standing beside me now, the last inheritor of an ancient covenant. Between the pictographs were symbols I did not recognize, but whose meaning I intuited through context, and the weight of accumulated observation markers for seasons, representations of specific mountains in the range, notations that might have been counts or dates in a system that predated human mathematics. The Yeti touched one carving near the chamber's entrance, a depiction of a smaller human figure standing beside a large guardian figure, and then gestured to me, and I understood with shocking clarity that I was represented here, that my relationship with this being had been anticipated or perhaps orchestrated, that I was part of a pattern that extended beyond my individual existence into something generational and predetermined. The realization should have felt like loss of agency, but instead it brought strange comfort, the sense of fitting into a design larger than myself, of serving a purpose that transcended personal ambition or understanding. And I felt the presence of my grandfather, whose journal had first hinted at these mysteries, wondering if he too had stood in this chamber or one like it, if he too had accepted a role in maintaining the boundary between legend and witnessed truth. The Yeti moved to a section of wall where the carvings were most elaborate, and in the beam of my headlamp I saw a narrative that explained everything and changed the very foundation of what I believed about these mountains and the relationship between human ambition and natural guardianship. The images showed humans arriving in the high places during an age when the earth was different, warmer perhaps or more welcoming, and the Yeti then numerous observing from distance as these strange small creatures pushed higher and higher despite obvious unsuitability for such elevations. The pictographs depicted early deaths, human figures falling or freezing, and showed the Yeti's initial response as simple observation, allowing nature to claim those who ventured beyond their capabilities. But then came a sequence that made my breath catch: a human child, separated from adults, dying in a crevasse while reaching toward the light above. The next carving showed a Yeti descending to retrieve the small body, and the figure's posture conveyed something that transcended species, a grief that resonated across the barriers of form and language. And I understood this moment as the origin point of the covenant, the instant when observation transformed into intervention. Subsequent images showed the Yeti bringing retrieved humans to sacred spaces, performing what could only be described as funeral rites. And I saw in these ancient carvings the same careful positioning of bodies, the same attention to personal effects, the same reverence I had witnessed in the chamber behind me. The narrative continued through centuries, showing how the practice became formalized, passed from one generation to the next, an inherited duty that gradually transformed from occasional mercy into systematic guardianship. And I traced the evolution of climbing equipment in the carvings, watching hemp rope become nylon, wooden ice axes become metal, primitive goggles become modern technical gear, each technological advancement represented with surprising accuracy by artists who could not possibly use such equipment themselves, but had studied it with evident care. The Yeti gestured to a series of carvings that showed not rescues but preventions, images of its kind appearing before human climbers and driving them back, creating rockfalls or showing themselves as frightening apparitions to turn expeditions away from areas marked with symbols I now recognized as warnings. I understood with dawning horror that many Yeti sightings, many of the encounters that had fueled legends and speculation, were not accidents or territorial aggression but deliberate interventions, attempts to prevent deaths before retrieval became necessary. And I thought of every reported sighting, every grainy photograph, every dismissed testimony as potentially representing a life saved through terror, rather than lost to the mountain. The creature beside me rumbled and touched a carving showing a massive avalanche, and I remembered the unexplained rock slide that had turned back my own first expedition 17 years ago, the one that veteran climbers still discussed as impossibly timed and located. And I wondered if I was looking at a depiction of my own salvation, a death prevented by intervention I had attributed to luck. The weight of unprovable truth crushed down on me as I recognized that the monster of legend was in fact the opposite, a guardian whose protection required it to be feared and avoided, whose salvation depended on maintaining the very mythology that cast it as threat, rather than shepherd. And I felt anger at the cosmic injustice of beings whose compassion required them to be misunderstood and reviled. The Yeti touched the final carving in the sequence, an image showing a single guardian figure standing among empty mountains, no other large forms visible, and then it touched its own chest, and the gesture contained an ocean of loneliness that made my throat constrict with sympathetic anguish, understanding that it had performed this duty alone for decades, perhaps longer, without companion or relief, bound by inherited responsibility to continue work that no one would ever acknowledge or appreciate. My hands shook as I traced the carvings, understanding I was touching a historical record that rewrote accepted narratives about these mountains and the relationship between human ambition and natural limits, knowledge that could never be shared because it would sound like madness. Transformation from respected guide to dismissed fantasist. The Yeti watched me process this realization, and I saw in its eyes something like sympathy for the burden of unshareable truth, recognition of the isolation that comes from witnessing what others cannot or will not believe. And I understood we were alike in this, both guardians of knowledge that served best when hidden. I thought of the families waiting below, the German expedition at the cavern entrance, the villagers who would ask what I had seen, and felt the future branching before me into paths of honesty that would destroy credibility or silence that would preserve sanity but betray truth. The creature moved to another section of wall where fresher carvings showed a smaller figure, clearly human, standing beside the guardian. and I recognized the clothing as similar to what my grandfather wore in old photographs. Confirmation that this covenant extended through my bloodline, that I had been prepared for this moment across generations. The Yeti touched the carving and then touched my shoulder, and the gesture conveyed both question and plea, asking if I would accept what my grandfather had apparently accepted, if I would become witness and keeper and bridge between hidden truth and necessary legend. And I felt the crushing responsibility of choice that was not really choice, that had been determined by ancestry and circumstance and 3 decades of inexplicable loyalty. I nodded acceptance, and felt something fundamental shift in the chamber's atmosphere, as if the mountain itself acknowledged a contract renewed, and the Yeti's eyes reflected my headlamp with what I chose to interpret as relief or gratitude. Though I understood I might be projecting human emotion onto something fundamentally other, the creature gestured back toward the bodies and then deeper into the mountain, where my light could not reach, and I understood there were more chambers, more preserved climbers, a network of sacred repositories extending through the range's heart, and I felt vertigo at the scope of tragedy and devotion these caves represented. The pictographs surrounded me like accusations or testimonies, centuries of death transformed through intention into something closer to meaning, and I realized the Yeti was not asking me to reveal everything but to witness, to carry knowledge that would inform my guidance of future expeditions, to become part of the prevention system by understanding what I was preventing. I touched the ice wall and felt the mountain's cold permanence, understanding I was being initiated into a fellowship that had no formal structure, no recognition, no reward except the knowledge that some debts might be prevented and others at least honored. And I thought of the years ahead, of future climbers I would turn back with warnings they would resent, of families I would comfort with partial truths that honored the dead while protecting the living from unbearable knowledge. The Yeti moved away from the wall carvings and returned to the center of the ice cathedral, settling onto its haunches with a weight that spoke of exhaustion beyond mere physical fatigue. And I understood I was witnessing something I had never seen. In all our decades of silent companionship, vulnerability, perhaps even desperation, it began drawing in the frost-covered floor with a massive finger, creating symbols with deliberate precision, and I crouched beside it, my headlamp illuminating each mark as if we were students and teachers in the world's most impossible classroom. The creature drew a sun rising and setting over and over, the repetition accelerating until the cycles became a blur, then added marks I recognized as years passing, decades, perhaps centuries, and I watched time itself rendered in ice crystals and claw marks. It drew multiple large figures, then began erasing them one by one, each deletion performed with a tenderness that made the gesture more devastating than violence could have been, until only a single figure remained, surrounded by emptiness that seemed to radiate from the drawing into the chamber itself. The Yeti touched that solitary form and then touched its own chest, and I felt something crack open inside me as I comprehended the totality of its isolation. This being who had outlived its entire kind while remaining bound to an inherited duty that offered no release. It drew small human figures approaching, mountains and falling, then the single guardian retrieving them, a cycle that repeated across the frost canvas with mechanical inevitability. And I saw in this simple pictograph a prison more complete than any bars could create, obligation stretching across time without end, or purpose beyond its own continuation. The creature's breathing had become labored, visible in the frozen air as great plumes of condensation, and I realized with shock that it was aging, that even beings of legend and endurance must eventually face their own mortality, and the drawings were not merely explanation but confession, perhaps even plea. It drew a final image that made my vision blur with unshed tears, a large figure lying still among the ice with the small human figure standing watch beside it, a reversal of roles that conveyed both prophecy and hope. And I understood it was asking if I would honor its death as it had honored so many others, if I would bear witness to the passing of the last guardian, if I would become the one who remembered when no one else remained to remember. The weight of that request crushed the breath from my lungs, making me gasp in the thin air, because accepting meant watching a friend die, meant carrying the knowledge that the covenant would end, that future climbers would face the mountain without invisible protection, that the accumulated compassion of centuries would vanish like breath in cold air. I wanted to refuse, to tell this ancient being that I could not bear what it was asking, But the words died unspoken because I saw in its eyes the same thing I had seen in the eyes of dying climbers. I could not save the desperate need not to face the final darkness alone, to have someone witness that the life lived had mattered, that the ending contained some measure of meaning beyond simple cessation. The Yeti stood and walked to the nearest preserved body, the German climber I had seen upon entering, and placed one massive hand gently on the ice, a benediction or farewell, and I understood it was showing me what I must become, the one who would tend these frozen sanctuaries when the guardian could no longer continue. It moved from body to body, touching each one with the same reverence, and I followed behind in a procession that felt more sacred than any ceremony I had witnessed in temples or monasteries below, because this ritual emerged from pure compassion rather than doctrine or tradition. The creature paused at each preserved climber and made a sound, a low rumble that might have been names or prayers or simply acknowledgement, and I tried to memorize each tone, each inflection, knowing I might someday need to complete this circuit alone, to honor dead I had never known in ways I barely understood. At the chamber's farthest reach, the Yeti touched a section of ice that was different, smoother, clearly prepared and waiting, and the implication made my throat tighten with grief I had no right to feel, yet could not suppress, because I understood I was being shown its chosen resting place, the final addition to this gallery of the mountain's lost souls. It turned to face me and reached out slowly, giving me time to step back if I chose, and when I remained still it placed one enormous hand on my head, the touch surprisingly gentle despite the evident strength in those fingers, and I felt the gesture as something between blessing and burden, acknowledgement that I would carry forward what it could no longer sustain. The hand lifted and the Yeti pointed back toward the tunnel we had entered through, releasing me from the vigil, giving permission to return to the world of light and living, and I understood that our next meeting might be the last, that some future winter would bring me to this cavern to find the guardian still and silent among those it had spent lifetimes protecting. I nodded through tears I could not explain to anyone who had not stood in this impossible place, accepting an inheritance I had never sought, but could not refuse, and the creature's eyes reflected my light one final time before it turned and walked deeper into the mountain, into darkness my beam could not penetrate, leaving me alone among the ice-entombed dead with knowledge that would isolate me from every living person I would ever encounter. The walk back through the cavern felt like moving through a dream of my own future, past all those serene faces and careful arrangements, each one representing failure transformed through devotion into something approaching grace, and I understood I was seeing my life's work redefined, not preventing summit attempts but preventing unnecessary deaths, not celebrating achievement but honoring limitation. I emerged from the cave into daylight that seemed brutal after the cathedral's gentle darkness, the expedition still waiting where I had left them, concern on their faces transforming to relief when they saw me, and I knew the questions would come, the demands for explanation I could never adequately provide. I told them the cave was unstable, dangerous, that we needed to descend immediately, and saw doubt in their eyes but also trust, the faith built over 3 decades of keeping clients safe even when they questioned my judgment, and I used that trust like currency to purchase their compliance, herding them down the mountain with urgency they mistook for weather concerns. That night in base camp one opened my grandfather's journal to passages I had read before, but never truly comprehended, descriptions of a guardian in the high places and a promise made to help protect both the living and the honored dead. And I understood my entire career had been preparation for this moment, decades of learning the mountain's moods and dangers and hidden places slowly revealing their true purpose. I wrote my own entry in careful script, knowing that someday my grandson or great-niece might need to read these words and understand what was being passed forward, that the covenant did not end with the Yeti's death but transformed, became something sustained by human witness rather than legendary guardian, evolved as all living traditions must if they are to survive beyond the extinction of their originators. The other guides asked what I had seen in the cave, and I offered them the lie that would protect both truth and their peace of mind, describing unstable ice and dangerous conditions, all technically accurate while concealing everything that mattered, and I felt the isolation of unshareable knowledge settling over me like the mountain shadow, permanent and cold and strangely comforting in its absoluteness. I spent the weeks following that revelation systematically going through my grandfather's journals, with obsessive attention, discovering passages that had seemed like romantic embellishment now revealed themselves as literal documentation of encounters that spanned generations, and I traced references backward through family histories kept in monastery archives, and village elder testimonies until a pattern emerged that took my breath away. With its implications, my great-great-grandfather had been the first, a hunter who encountered a family of guardians during a winter storm and exchanged knowledge of safe passages for a promise to watch over both the creatures and the mountain's lost souls, creating a covenant that had been carefully passed from father to son, teacher to student, across more than a century of silent cooperation. The journals described specific locations I had visited with the Yeti, detailed behaviors I had witnessed but never thought to record, contained sketched symbols that matched perfectly the cave wall carvings, and I understood I had been living inside a narrative much larger than my individual life, that my career choices and mountain obsessions had been shaped by inheritance I had not consciously known but had somehow always felt in my blood and bones. Most devastating was finding my own grandfather's final entry, written 3 days before he died, describing a dream in which the last guardian came to him and asked if the bloodline would hold, if the promise would survive another generation, if his grandson could be trusted with knowledge that would isolate him from normal human connection, and my grandfather had answered yes, committing me to this duty before I was old enough to understand what was being offered or demanded. I felt anger at this presumption initially, rage that my life had been quietly directed toward purposes I had no voice in choosing, but the fury dissolved into something more complex as I recognized how much meaning and purpose this invisible inheritance had given me, how my decades on the mountain had never felt like obligation but like coming home to something essential and true. I understood then that the most profound callings are not chosen but recognized, that we spend our lives unconsciously preparing for moments of clarity when everything suddenly coheres into pattern and purpose, when the random becomes intentional and the coincidental reveals itself as destined. I began training my nephew, Pemba, with the same careful indirection my grandfather had used with me, taking him on expeditions to specific locations, teaching him to read weather signs that went beyond meteorology into something more instinctive and ancient, showing him how to leave offerings at certain pauses without explaining why, and I watched his natural aptitude emerge with recognition that felt like relief and sorrow intertwined. He never questioned the unusual aspects of his education, accepting them with the same unconscious knowing I had possessed at his age, and I saw my younger self reflected in his careful attention to the mountain's moods, his intuitive grasp of roots that avoided danger through logic he could not articulate, his comfort in solitude that marked him as someone capable of bearing witness to profound isolation. I gave him my grandfather's journals on his 20th birthday, watching his face as he read the passages that would redefine his understanding of our family's relationship with these peaks, and saw the same mixture of fear and exhilaration I had experienced, the recognition that his life had always been moving toward this revelation, that what he was learning was not new information but confirmation of something he had always suspected. Waited in the high places, we climbed together to the hidden valley where I had first met the Yeti decades ago, and I told him everything: the rescues, the cave, the preserved climbers, the ancient duty now passing from legendary guardian to human keeper, and his questions came not from doubt but from desire to understand his role in this continuing story, how to honor what came before while adapting to what must come next. I realized in that moment that my grandfather's presumption had not been arrogance but wisdom, understanding that some knowledge cannot be offered as choice but must be given as inheritance, planted like seeds that only germinate when the recipient is ready to bear both the beauty and burden of their blooming. The turning point came during an expedition 2 years later when Pemba and I encountered a lost climber, delirious from exposure and altitude sickness, far off the standard routes, and I saw my nephew automatically move to shield the man from wind, while I assessed the situation, working together with synchronization that came from shared purpose deeper than mere training. We got the climber to safety, but in those critical moments I had felt something shift, an understanding that the work would continue, that the covenant was being honored not through single heroic figures, but through accumulated, small acts of protection and witness that rippled across generations, each keeper adding their own chapter to a story that transcended individual lives. On the descent I told Pemba about the Yeti's final communication, the request to be remembered, to not face extinction alone, and I saw tears freeze on his weathered cheeks as he grasped the full weight of what we carried: not just knowledge of the legendary guardian, but responsibility for ensuring that the compassion it embodied would not vanish even after its death. that human hands would continue the work of retrieving and honoring the lost, that the covenant would evolve into something sustained by choice and consciousness rather than by duty and isolation. We stopped at a small shrine near base camp, and Pemba added a stone to the cairn, whispering words I did not ask him to translate. And I understood we had become something my grandfather had only hoped for, a lineage consciously committed to serving as bridge between the mountain's ancient mysteries and the modern world's casual relationship with forces beyond its comprehension. That night I dreamed of the ice cathedral for the first time in months, but instead of the Yeti alone among the preserved dead, I saw a long line of figures stretching back into shadow. My grandfather, his father before him, generations of keepers I had never known, and they were not guarding but witnessing their presence, transforming the cavern from tomb to temple, their accumulated attention creating sanctuary where there might otherwise have been only abandonment and ice. I woke with absolute certainty that the Yeti was not the last guardian, but the first of a new kind, that its death would not end the covenant but transform it, passing from legend into lived tradition, from solitary ancient burden into shared human commitment sustained by understanding rather than imposed by inheritance alone. I understood finally that my grandfather's gift had not been knowledge, but permission to see beyond the surface world, to accept that some truths operate outside conventional belief, to commit to purposes that would isolate me from easy connection while binding me to something more enduring than ordinary human relationships, to become part of a story that would outlive my individual existence while giving that existence meaning beyond the accumulation of personal achievement or comfort. The isolation I had feared would result from carrying this secret revealed itself as something more paradoxical, a solitude that connected me across time to others who had borne similar witness, a loneliness that was actually deep, belonging to a community of keepers scattered across generations and geography, each one standing watch in their own way, each one honoring the lost and protecting the living, each one ensuring that the mountain's heights remained not just physical challenge, but sacred space, where human fragility encountered something ancient and compassionate, where death could be met with dignity rather than abandonment, where the last guardian's final request to be remembered, to not vanish without witness, would be fulfilled, not just through my solitary vigil, but through the continuation of a tradition, now consciously chosen and understood, transformed from mythic obligation into deliberate grace. The call came on a February morning when the thermometer read -30, and the wind carried that particular sharpness that signals major weather systems moving in from the Tibetan plateau. Pemba reached me by radio with 3 words that stopped my heart: "He's walking out." I knew instantly what he meant, gathered supplies with hands that trembled despite decades of mountain discipline, and made the climb to the hidden valley one final time, my 62-year-old body protesting every step while my spirit pulled me forward with desperate urgency. The Yeti waited at the cave entrance, smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I was seeing him truly for the first time, without the distorting lens of fear and legend, his white fur yellowed with age, his massive shoulders bent under weight that had nothing to do with physical burden and everything to do with centuries of solitary witness. He made the low rumbling sound that had become our greeting, and I approached close enough to see my reflection in those ancient amber eyes, close enough to reach out and touch the scarred hand that had pulled me from death so many winters ago. We sat together as we had done countless times, but this meeting carried the weight of finality, the knowledge that this would be our last shared silence, our last communion in the space between human and legend, where understanding required no common language. He gestured toward the ice cathedral deep within the mountain, then to me, then made a motion I had never seen before, placing his enormous hand over his heart, and then extending it outward, a gesture so clearly asking if I would continue, if I would remember, if the covenant would hold even after he had walked beyond the edge of the world, into whatever awaited the last of his kind. I made the promise again, this time not with my grandfather's words but my own, telling him in the mixture of Nepali and gesture that had become our dialect that the work would continue, that the lost would be honored, that his existence would be witnessed and remembered not as monster or myth, but as guardian and companion across decades of shared purpose. I showed him photographs of Pemba and 3 other young guides I had been quietly preparing, explained in words he could not understand, but in tone he absolutely could, that he was not leaving this duty to one aging man, but to a conscious tradition that would outlive us both, that his centuries of solitary vigil had seeded something that would continue growing long after both of us had become part of the mountain's eternal ice, He studied the photographs with careful attention, his huge fingers surprisingly gentle as he touched each face. And I saw something in his expression that I had never witnessed before: relief, profound and absolute. The release of burden carried so long it had become indistinguishable from identity itself. We spent that day in the cave, him showing me details of the wall carvings I had missed, indicating specific symbols that related to weather patterns and safe routes, sharing knowledge accumulated across lifetimes in his final conscious act of teaching, his last gift to ensure the work would continue with something approaching the wisdom his kind had possessed. As evening came and the storm he had predicted began howling outside, he stood slowly and walked to the cave entrance, and I understood with crystalline clarity that he was giving me permission to not follow, to not witness whatever came next, to let him pass beyond observation into mystery. But I could not grant him that solitude, could not let the last of his kind vanish without witness, and so I followed at a respectful distance as he climbed higher than I had ever gone, into regions where the air itself felt thin as gauze, and every breath was a negotiation with survival. The storm intensified until I could barely see his massive form ahead of me, a shadow moving with purpose through curtains of driven snow, and I realized he was leading me to something, one final revelation he had saved for this moment of ending. We emerged above the storm into that impossible clarity that sometimes exists at extreme altitude, where the sky darkens to indigo and stars appear even in daylight, and I saw what he had brought me to witness: a ridge formation that from this precise angle revealed itself as massive carved figures, his ancestors rendered in living rock on a scale that dwarfed human achievement, their stone faces watching over the valleys below, with expressions of such compassion that I fell to my knees despite the cold, understanding finally that this mountain itself was monument and temple, that his kind had not merely guarded these peaks, but had shaped them into sanctuary and memorial. He stood before the stone figures and made a sound I had never heard, something between song and mourning, a vocalization that seemed to vibrate through rock and ice and bone, and the wind ceased for just a moment as though the mountain itself was listening to its last guardian's farewell. Then he turned to me, placed both hands briefly on my shoulders in blessing and recognition, and walked forward into the stone and snow and gathering darkness, his white form becoming indistinguishable from the mountain itself until I could no longer tell where legend ended and landscape began. I descended alone to the returning storm, carrying the weight of that final witness, understanding that what I had seen would become the foundation for everything that followed, the seed of transformation, from which new growth would emerge. When I reached base camp, Pemba knew without asking, saw the knowledge in my face and simply nodded, and together we began the work of honoring what had ended while protecting what continued, two keepers in a tradition that had transformed from myth into conscious choice, from inherited burden into deliberate grace. In the seasons since, we have retrieved for lost climbers, arranged them in the ice cathedral with the same care the Yeti once provided, and trained others to understand the mountain not as conquest, but as sacred trust requiring protection and humility. The climbers who come to us now sense something different in how we guide, a reverence that goes beyond safety protocols into recognition of the profound and mysterious, and some few among them prove ready to learn what lies beneath the surface world, to become part of a story that stretches backward into legend and forward into uncertain, but purposeful future. I watch Pemba teach the youngest guides how to read the mountain's moods, how to honor the lost, how to stand witness to forces beyond human comprehension, and I see my grandfather's wisdom fulfilled, not the ending of an ancient tradition, but its metamorphosis, its passage from the realm of legend into lived human commitment, its transformation from solitary guardian to community of keepers, each one adding their chapter to a story that will outlive us all yet carry forward the essence of what the last Yeti embodied, ensuring that the mountain's heights remain not just physical challenge but holy ground where death meets dignity, and the lost are never truly abandoned, where one life given to witness and protection ripples across generations in waves of meaning that touch shores we will never see but trust will endure. What would you protect if you knew you were the last witness? Subscribe to encounter more stories where legends walk among us and the line between myth and truth dissolves into something profound and true.